Hey everyone, Rob here from ServerScaler. Thank you to those of us who've joined us today for our Windows Virtual Desktop webinar. Today we're going to be running through everything your firm needs to know about Windows Virtual Desktop. So in our agenda, a little bit of an introduction. We call it WVD, which is obviously an acronym. Being an IT company, of course, we use acronyms for everything, but how does WVD work, being Windows Virtual Desktop? Why do you need it, or what's the value of using Windows Virtual Desktop? We'll go through a bit of a case study, so something that we've done for another client of ours, just to give you a bit of insight into how you might actually apply it within your firm, and obviously what the results are. So the first thing is, what is Windows Virtual Desktop? So Windows Virtual Desktop enables secure remote work. Provides end users with familiarity and compatibility of Windows 10. So it's basically a Windows 10 session that you remote into. It's contained within Microsoft Azure that they can run on their own device. So it's infinitely scalable. Multi-session experience means you don't have to go and procure new Windows licenses or do any of that. So it's just attached to a Microsoft 365 license. And at ServerScaler, we manage the end-to-end deployment of those services alongside Microsoft 365 and anything else you might need in the Microsoft Azure stack. So when we're talking about WVD and how it works, basically a user can bring their own device, or it might be a company issued device. They initiate a terminal server session into the Windows Virtual Desktop, and it's just a Windows 10 computer, basically, that they remote into. So it feels exactly the same as what they use on their desktop every day at the moment, except it's hosted off in Microsoft Azure. Now, what I'd like to do is just go through some prerequisite knowledge that you may need to have to understand how this architecture works. So the first thing that you need to understand is that Microsoft 365 and Microsoft Azure are two completely different things. So often they're intertwined in terms of the service offering and how they clip together, and they deliver things back and forward to one another, but they're actually two completely different services. So Microsoft 365 is software as a service, and Microsoft Azure is infrastructure as a service. Now, to sort of define what those two things are, Microsoft 365 is your software applications. So if you have a traditional network where you have servers and computers contained within a single computer network, when we're talking about software as a service, we're talking about the software applications. So we might be talking about something like Microsoft Word, which you have on your computer, or Microsoft Outlook. Microsoft Outlook will connect to an Exchange server or your email server, which you might have on premises. Now it's being delivered through Microsoft 365 as a software or as an application, as a service. And your Outlook client will obviously connect directly to that service over the internet, so software as a service. Azure, on the other hand, is servers and network. So where you used to have an Exchange server on premises and your clients would connect to that server, now that the application is off somewhere else, the server infrastructure itself and the network that you use to connect to it from your desktop client, that's infrastructure. So that's your network infrastructure. And so that's what Microsoft Azure is. It's servers and networking hosted in the cloud. The other term that might be relevant in all of this is the term tenant. So you may have heard IT people refer to the term tenant before. So when we're talking about a tenant, we're talking about your little box or your little part, your space on either the Microsoft 365 or the Azure service. So that's exclusive to you. That's your little portion of that service offering and is completely separate, obviously locked out from everybody else except to you, but you have complete control over that environment within either of those services. So the next thing is, why might you consider using infrastructure as a service? Why might you consider pushing stuff into Microsoft Azure? There's a few key reasons why you might do it, and we'll list some of those out now. Firstly, bandwidth. So if you have a network on premises and you have users connecting into that network remotely, so they might be using something like terminal services currently, you have to rely on your internet connection that you're paying for. So you might be constrained by only having access to NBN. You might not have a fiber service there. Into the Azure network, On the other hand, they have a huge big data pipe, so that you'll never run into bandwidth challenges while you're trying to connect to your infrastructure. So if you move all your on-premises servers into Azure, the ability to connect to them, you'll obviously be able to connect over a really, really fast network. Scalability. So scalability is really important. You might find there's a scenario where you'll need extra resources to process stuff on demand. So let's say, for example, you have a database server on premises on a physical server, and you go, wow, I really wish I had more memory or a faster disk speed to be able to process stuff on this server. Obviously, you can't do that with a physical server on premises. Now, in something like Microsoft Azure, it's just a matter of going into the configuration, adding more resources to it from the data center. So you draw down on the data center hardware resources and allocate them to your virtual servers that you have with that infrastructure. So it's infinitely scalable. So you can just continue to keep throwing resources at things. The other thing that happens is it's very flexible. So provisioning and decommissioning servers and infrastructure that you may or may not need as the business changes and you move is very, very simple. It's just a matter of ticking things on and off, which sure beats running out and installing physical servers and bits of equipment into your environment. Not that I don't like coming to visit you, but it is much easier to do it if we can do a tick and flick from our office remotely. Simplicity is another thing, and I know that the things that we talk about, the concepts we talk about here are quite complex, but the simplicity and the management overhead of having everything consolidated into a single place, and we'll get into the WVD bits of the virtual desktop, but having all of your desktops, your servers, your infrastructure and your network all consolidated into a single stack makes the management overhead really, really simple. So bringing people in, making sure all of your data is contained within there, backups and security, all of those bits and pieces being able to be managed from one stack, super, super simple. Reliability. So there'll be no business interruption in the event of a failure. If something happens in the data center, it automatically replicates, it will automatically allocate other hardware. All of those automations and failovers behind the scenes will cause zero business impact to you. Now, if that same thing occurred in your office on physical hardware, of course, you would have business interruption. So that's another consideration for that. And the final thing in terms of why you might consider moving your stuff up there is security. So backups and disaster recovery is super, super simple. It's all contained still within that data center stack through Microsoft Azure, replicated to other sites, of course. So if anything was to ever happen, there's failover there. There's a whole bunch of information management controls you can put in place as well. So basically the ingress or egress data, so data coming into and going out of that service, you can put a series of limitations for people connecting to that service, what they can and can't pull out. So that's one of the advantages of using something like Windows Virtual Desktop, is that you can configure it so that people can't remove data from that network, or inversely push data into it. And why that might be valuable is you might say, have sent everybody home to go and work from home while COVID was happening, and you couldn't come to the office, and you went, okay, everyone go and use your home computer to connect to our corporate network. You don't know what people are doing on their home computers. You know, their kids are using it, they're downloading all sorts of stuff. It's a shared device, it's got no security on it, it's got no controls, it's just, you know, it's a home user environment. You might want to block their ability to upload anything which could be malicious, particularly into that environment, to secure out basically your corporate network. So really powerful there. So the next thing is why you might consider using Windows Virtual Desktop. So if you move all of your infrastructure into something like Microsoft Azure, your ability to connect to it changes. So often, as is often the case, when we have a server on premises, there is a particular requirement for a software application to have what is called a client-server connection. So on the same network, a computer with a piece of software will need to connect to the server, and that needs to be on the same network. Now, for most of our customers who have on-premise or had historically on-premises infrastructure, they would have a terminal server to allow people to remote in so that they could access those applications. Windows Virtual Desktop is to replace terminal server with something that is more familiar and more compatible by using Windows 10. So Windows Virtual Desktop is a Windows 10 desktop that has been virtualized and is contained within the Microsoft Azure tenant. And what that means is because it's part of that tenant or part of that virtual network that's contained within Microsoft Azure, it has the ability to connect directly to the other services or other servers that are contained within that network, the same as it would have done on premises. So, but from a Windows 10 perspective, so instead of having to have a Windows Server with terminal services and complex licensing and all of those things, you get Windows 10. So, or also Windows 7 is still supported as well for legacy systems. One of the only places that Windows 7 is still supported. So you have the familiarity and compatibility of that Windows 10 environment. There's a few different ways you can configure it as well. So when we're talking about virtualization, we're talking about emulation of hardware. So the hardware that you have in your computer, if you had a whole cluster of them, say thousands of them, like you have in a data center, the ability for the data center to deliver that hardware through to a virtual desktop. So it's not, it uses physical hardware, but the physical hardware is saying, oh, here's some pretend resources. So here's some CPU and some memory and some disk space, and you can install Windows 10 onto that, and then you can use it. So you can either do it in one of two ways. You can either do a one-to-one. So basically you have a dedicated device, a virtual device that sits in Microsoft Azure, which would be your own personal computer that you set up there. The other way you can do it is have multi-session hosts, which I actually think is a better way of doing it. So one-to-one is one virtual computer per user, and you set one virtual computer up for everybody. Or you can use a shared service or a multi-session service on a single host. So the same way that terminal services works, but with Windows 10. So a better way of doing it. From there, you can then go into the next step with Windows Virtual Desktop, which is host clustering. So you basically have multiple hosts, servers that host all of the individual desktops. And what will happen is you can apply a load balancer over the top of that. So essentially when you connect, it'll go, okay, well, which server is under the least amount of load right now? And you'll be routed across to a device or a virtual host that has the resource availability for you to be able to connect and to work on that platform most effectively and efficiently. The other byproduct of that is that you have failover as well. So if something was to fail on one of those devices or something like pear-shaped, it would automatically just route you to one of the other devices. The other thing that you can do is in low demand scenarios is you can actually shut these other devices off, these other hosts. So the way that Microsoft Azure billing works is it's based on consumption of service. So if you're not consuming that service, if that server or that host, that virtual desktop host isn't on, you can switch it off, which is uniquely advantageous, particularly over periods like Christmas where nobody's working. You can shut down those virtual desktop hosts and just leave one going on the odd chance that somebody may want to log in. So advantageous there. You can also do session configuration. So different configuration sets for different users and groups. So when they hit the interface to log in, it will identify who they are. So their identity comes from Microsoft 365, which is where we set them up. We replicate that across their identities across into the Microsoft Azure tenant. It'll work out who they are, and then it'll apply the policies when they try and authenticate and log in. So you may have some different policies for people. You may have policies that say, hey, this user can't print or copy any data out of the virtual desktop, because that's all about corporate information. We don't want them to do that. And as we can see on the screen here, where the red X is on the virtual desktop back to the user's own device, we can block that. We can also block it coming the other way, so data ingress. So being able to bring data into that environment, we can block that as well. So there's different configurations that we can apply for different users and groups, and it will automatically assign that on user login. Session broker configuration. So again, that's just coming back to limiting what can and can't be taken out of that environment. And that session broker configuration is great as well, because if you say have an employee exit the business, it's just a matter of disabling their account at 365 level. That will synchronize across into Azure, and they won't be able to log into that environment anymore. So really powerful tool to have there. As you can see from our little diagram here, we have users' own device, and there's a little X on their ability to bypass Windows Virtual Desktop to access those stack of applications that sit behind it. That's something else that we can do as well. So provide limitations there. So the only way that they'll be able to get access to any of those applications is via the virtual desktop, And if their user account gets disabled and they can't log in anymore, they literally don't have access to anything. And we've limited their ability to take any data out of that environment as well. So there's no possible way for your data to be leaked out of that environment, because the backend services can only be connected to via the virtual desktop, and that's the only way that the user can get access, and they can't push anything in or bring anything out of that environment. So really powerful security there. So the single gateway to the internet. So on the back of the virtual desktop, we have a single gateway to the internet, which means you can secure things. So if you have SaaS applications that sit in the cloud, so as an example, we might be talking about things like practice management systems, Leap and Action Step and Clio and Spokeball and many of those other software as a service applications. You'll be able to restrict or constrain the login to only come from the virtual desktop based on that user's authentication. So they can't log into it from their own device and do anything. So powerful security tools there if you needed them. It also meets all of the data sovereignty requirements. So if data sovereignty applies to you, depending on what area of practice you work in or what area of business you work in more broadly. In fact, this stuff is all based on Australian servers as well. So it means all of the data will stay here. So you can be confident that it is going to meet any data sovereignty requirements that you have. The other thing that's really cool is that Microsoft Teams is supported. So one of the challenges with using some of the other managed desktop environments and terminal services is that the full functionality of Microsoft Teams isn't supported, but in Windows Virtual Desktop through Azure, it is. So that's voice and video calling, chat, and all of the other bits and pieces that obviously come through into Microsoft Teams. So a consideration there. Now, it all sounds great, but there are obviously some limitations to virtual desktop as well. One of the biggest limitations, and it's always everyone's biggest fear, is if you don't have an internet connection, you don't have access to your corporate environment. So there is no offline synchronization capability of any of the data. So that could be seen as a potential constraint. We're pretty fortunate here. We tend to have access to the internet everywhere, which is really great. But if you didn't have access to the internet, it would limit your ability to be able to access your corporate information and applications. You'll still need a computer or a laptop to access it. So it doesn't defer the requirement or offset the requirement to get a physical desktop for you to be able to connect to that session. That being said, in terms of the processing resources required, because that's all contained within Microsoft Azure, within the data center, it will actually use Microsoft Azure's hardware to be able to process the transactions. And the advantage of that is that you don't need a highly spec machine for you to be able to connect to that and essentially process the transaction. So you can get a very low spec machine just so you can connect to that service to be able to complete what you need to do, which are cheap to replace. They're obviously cheap to procure up front, and you can essentially buy them from anywhere. So the requirement for things like professional operating system and all of those bits and pieces get taken out of the mix. You don't need to worry about any of that. You just need the ability to initiate via the app a connection to the Windows Virtual Desktop. It's just someone else's computer. And I love this about cloud, and I love explaining it this way, is that you used to have, or once upon a time, probably had servers on premises, and all infrastructure as a service or moving all of your stuff to Microsoft Azure is taking it out of your office and essentially putting it in theirs. So it might not make sense to everyone. So if you're a single office environment, you've got no one connecting from home, you don't have satellite offices, you're not worried about the ingress or egress of data or data walking out of your environment when someone comes or leaves the business, then this might not make sense to you, as something that you would want to procure for your business. And the other thing is that it can be expensive on TCO, so total cost of ownership. If you assess the total cost of ownership of putting everything in there, based on the total cost of ownership calculations, does it make sense for you to do that? And does the reward outweigh the cost? So there is obviously some key advantages to being in Microsoft Azure and having all of your stuff there, but you need to assess whether that outweighs what the potential cost of that is going to be. For some clients, depending on what their requirements are, sometimes the total cost of ownership of being in Microsoft Azure is actually cheaper for them over a term, so be it 3 years is often what we run with. Their total cost of ownership sometimes can be actually lower being in Microsoft Azure than it is having on-premises infrastructure, particularly if they're a multi-site office and it's a particularly complicated network, but it is something that would need to be considered as part of your approach to looking at taking something like this on. Now, one of the other things that I want to do is I actually want to draw this out in a more elaborate diagram on a whiteboard. So for those of you who know me, you know that I love doing whiteboarding and I whiteboard stuff all the time. I'm going to use my digital whiteboard today, so bear with me while I work through with drawing with my finger because I didn't bring my pen, but we'll see how we get on with this. So the reason I actually want to draw this out is to give you an idea of where Windows Virtual Desktop sits in regards to Azure, where your other services sit or your other servers sit, and then where Microsoft 365, so that's the software applications, think of your Exchange, so your emails and SharePoint, where your documents and data, your OneDrive, your Teams, and all of those other applications in the Microsoft 365 stack. And hopefully the graphical drawing will help you wrap your head around it. I do appreciate that it can be quite complex to understand some of the things that we talk about. So the first thing that we're going to draw is we're going to draw your endpoint devices. So your endpoint devices will be these little X's over here. Now, these endpoint devices can be anywhere. It doesn't matter. They don't need to be in a corporate network. They don't even need to be a corporate issued device. It doesn't particularly matter. They just need to have the ability to install a Windows desktop client app so that they can connect to the Windows Virtual Desktop Session Broker. The next thing that we're going to draw on here, if I can click the right thing, is we're going to draw what is going to be Azure. Now, I also appreciate that I pronounce it Azure, which I'm sure much of the disgust of Microsoft who call it Azure. But I feel like that's the American way of pronouncing it. So if you think I'm wrong, that's cool. You can let me know. I don't mind. I say lots of things wrong. So here we have Azure as a data center. Now the green represents your tenant. So that's your space. And adjacent to your space and that, there will be another tenant that will sit up there, and there'll be another tenant that will sit up here, and you'll all draw on those data center resources which will be delivered through into your tenant so that you have things that you can use. So in this tenant, we have the WVD host, or it could be multiple hosts that sit in there that these endpoint users will connect into. They will be displayed to that end user as a Windows 10 computer. So it'll fill the whole screen, it'll support multiple screens, it'll just feel like you're using your normal computer, but you'll just be connected into this remote session. So also contained within your Azure tenant will be your other servers. So if you are a law firm, for example, and you have an on-premises application, and there's quite a few of them, some examples I can rattle off the top of my head. I know that Lexis Affinity, Infinity Law, Practice Evolve, there's a whole bunch, FilePro, Open Practice. There's a whole bunch of practice management systems which are on-premises applications. Now, those on-premises applications work from the client server, so they're expected that the server will be in the same network as the computers. When you were in Microsoft Azure, if you were to put your practice management server, or your practice management system on a server contained within Microsoft Azure, this is the same network. So they're on the same network. There is an internet connection that will connect this tenant to the internet. So if I can get the right color here. So this will be your internet connection, your internet gateway. That's also where the session broker sits, and everything will come in and out of that. And that is a virtual network that essentially replicates what a physical network would be in your office. So same thing, which means that these virtual desktop hosts can directly connect to that practice management system and work exactly the same way that they did in the office. Now, you might have some other bits and pieces there as well. You might have a database server. You might have a file server. You might have your legacy application server sitting in there as well. You can have as many servers as you want, and we can allocate, based on the configuration within Azure, we can allocate as many resources, hardware resources to that as we like. So if it doesn't need many, we don't allocate many. If it needs a lot, then we can allocate a lot. Also contained, or also connected to that tenant, is the ability to do backups and disaster recovery. So we will snapshot the servers in here. We'll snapshot these servers, and these servers. So that in the event of a failure, remembering they still are a Windows computer, updates and problems happen. We know that updates and problems happen with applications as well, but within the Azure stack, it will give us the ability to point in time restore that as well. So we snapshot those along the way. Something goes pear-shaped, we go, hey, recover it from 5 minutes ago and drop it back in. And because of the essentially unlimited hardware that we have available to us to be able to do that, from that data center, that process is really, really fast. So we're not waiting on the speed of the internet connection, which we can see here. We're not waiting on the speed of that. It's all contained within that stack. So really, really powerful. And in terms of off-site backup, it's still contained within the Azure stack. It'll do data center replication, so it will replicate to other data centers. So our offsite replication piece is actually occurring as a byproduct of that as well. We can also do backups of the data that sits in there. So if you just needed to do data restore instead of doing a complete server restore, there's the ability to do that. So that's all super, super simple when it's contained within there. There's no plugging hard drives in, waiting for backup software to load, being able to bring that stuff back in. You can do that stuff almost instantly. Super, super quick, really, really powerful. So we talked about the network. That's basically a consolidated network, replication of what you would have on site, some of the distinct advantages to having your infrastructure in there and the power of that and what you can do with it, which is obviously going to keep things on an even keel so you don't have any business interruption. And when there is in the unlikely event, it's really quick to restore that so that business interruption is kept to a minimum. We know that people can access that from anywhere. The ability to scale it up and scale it down, super, super simple. So if we need to add more resources, we can just throw more Azure resources in from the data center because we know we need to scale it up. And if we need to add more users into each of these things as well, same process, we can draw down on the data center resources, allocate those to your tenant, and be able to grow that up very, very quickly without having to replace physical servers and physical infrastructure. Now, the one bit that we didn't talk about is the way that this environment will interface with other applications, so SaaS applications. So here we have our internet connection that we were looking at before, which sits here. Now, this internet connection is a pipe, the one way in, one way out. It has a static IP, so we can see what that is now. I'm going to actually draw it, we'll replicate it over this side. We'll refer to this side as the session broker to come in. But when we're going out the other side, it comes from one IP. Now, when we have our other applications, so it might be 365, which as we discussed, actually sits as a separate application stack, so sits outside of Azure. It's a completely different thing. We may be able to configure it to only accept connections from our Azure tenant. So if you don't want people to have access to all of the stuff in 365 on their mobiles and data and whatever they feel like connecting to it from, we can actually constrain that to only accept connections from Azure. If you have an external or a SaaS application, so practice management system hosted in the cloud, this might be your PMS over here, and you might go, you know what, I don't want anybody to access it apart from the tenancy that I control. You can do the same thing, and you could restrict it to only accept connections from there. So that's also very powerful. The other thing that happens within Azure is for Windows Virtual Desktop, it actually relies on licensing delivery from the 365 tenant over here. So the license delivery happens via a synchronization that occurs with your Azure tenant. So these things are integrated after configuration, of course, where the things from the 365 tenant will be made available. The authentication will come through into the Azure tenant. So I have a very ugly diagram. I hope that makes some more sense, but you're always welcome to reach out to me and ask any questions you might have about it at any point in time. So why do you need it? Well, I'm hoping we address that as part of going through, but WVD will allow you to allow your employees to access it remotely, easy ability to scale up, scale down, might cost some cost savings. So, you know, in terms of the devices that they need to access, you may not need to procure very, very robust devices and physical hardware to have on site. You can obviously get those thin client machines. You can turn services off when you're not using them and scale it back down. So as opposed to buying a big server and scaling down and being stuck with a big server, you can scale that back. You'll also strengthen the security of your data. So depending on how far you want to take it, the ability to take it that far is there. So it will actually give you the flexibility to do so. And you'll be able to securely bring people in and out of your organisation. So if you have a very transient workforce where you're bringing contractors in for short periods of time, or there are some particular requirements where you need to have your data very, 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 very secure from anyone, it gives you the capability to do that and be able to bring people in and out of the business so that they can only have access to the things that it's relevant for them to have access to. So super, super important there. So we'll go through very, very quickly, just a high level case study. So I actually worked with a business recently to put this infrastructure in place because they had very, very particular compliance requirements around their data and basically on their reporting side, what they had to report to particular industry bodies. So now they have the ability to provision and deprovision new users easily. So they can just essentially bring them in and out, knowing that none of the data is leaving and nothing malicious is coming into that network as well. So only the data that gets created within that network stays in that network. They run all the operations from a centralized interface too. So they're all around Australia, they're all around the country. But from their perspective, they can just jump in, single interface and manage everything. It is super, super simple. And staff we don't need to manage the endpoints. So, you know, people bring their own device. So you bring people in, you bring contractors in. We don't need to worry about their devices, their antivirus, their security, any of their other licenses. That is solely their responsibility. All we do is provision them access. We limit their ability to inject or ingest any data within, into our tenant or into our environment. And that makes that super, super simple. So a really great outcome for that client head office based here in Newcastle. So that comes to the end of our virtual desktop webinar. Thank you for everybody who made the time to come along. I hope you found it insightful and interesting. Of course, if you do have any questions about virtual desktop, Microsoft Azure, Microsoft 365, or any combination of the above, feel free to reach out to the team and I at ServerScaler. This is our day-to-day and what we do. We'd love to hear from you, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Cheers.